Were you there when I crucified your Lord? Were you there when I crucified your Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when I crucified your Lord? I was there when he said, forgive them all. I was there when he said, forgive them all. Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. I was there when he said, forgive them all. It is finished, that's what I heard him say. It is finished, that's what I heard him say. Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. It is finished, that's what I heard him say. It is finished, that's what I heard him say.
My dear friends, I want to thank you for being here. If the brothers who invited you have not told you, my name is Julius. I was a centurion until recently when I deserted after the death of a dear friend. In my brief time with you, I want to tell you the story of three men. The story of a man whom I knew for only a few hours, a man whom I knew for many years, and myself. I will begin with me. You see, when I was a young boy, I lived in the foothills of the Alps, far north of Rome. And in our village, as we nestled in that beautiful valley, there was only one thing we feared, and that was the barbarians. One day as my father went to hunt, I saw him leaving the village, and my mother sent me to the well to get water. And I heard thunder. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was the thunder of 100 barbarians on huge black horses that were coming to raid our village. I saw a barbarian kill my father. I turned to my mother. My mother cried to me. She said, "Julius, run, run, run!" I could not leave my mother. I dropped the water bucket and I ran to her. And as I was running between me and her, a huge barbarian passed. And as he left, I saw that he had stabbed her with his spear. She fell to her knees and she held out her arms and she said, "Julius, come quickly." And I ran to her and she took the blood from her chest and she rubbed it on my head and my face. And she said, "Julius, lay down with me while I die, for they will see that you are covered with blood and they will pass you over." I laid there for what seemed like hours. They burned every house in the village and they left. And when I arose, I was the only survivor. But it left me with one thing. In my life, all I wanted to do was to avenge the death of my mother and my father, and it didn't matter whom I killed to do that. Several days later, a Roman garrison found me. They adopted me. I became their servant boy. I dressed the centurion. I carried packs. I carried spears. I carried tents. And when I became old enough, I became a legionnaire. In my career, I had many battles and many campaigns, and eventually, I wound up in a town called Jerusalem. And because my centurion had seen how much I enjoyed avenging my mother and my father, I was given the task of crucifying the criminals. One day, as I stood at the garrison headquarters, they brought a man in to be flogged. They stripped him of his clothes. They tied him to a post. I had seen this 1,000 times. But something different was happening. Over against a wall, 2 soldiers were making a crown out of thorns. As the man with the cat o' nine tails stood there, the 2 soldiers came over, and one of them grabbed this man by the hair of his head and yanked his head back, and the other one took the crown of thorns and shoved him down on his head. Blood began to flow down his back, over his ears. As the blood dripped from his eyebrows and hit his cheeks, it looked like he was crying great drops of blood. And then the man hit him. And he hit him. And what made this so strange was the man said not a word. I had been in Jerusalem long enough to have been here on this feast of Passover that the Jews were celebrating, and I had been at the temple. And I had seen lambs brought in for slaughter, and the one thing that amazed me was they made not a sound. I didn't understand it at the time, but something strange was happening here. When they finished flogging him, they threw a robe on his shoulder, and my centurion told me to take him up on the portico to Pilate. I took him up there. I shoved him out. There was a great crowd that was gathered, and Pilate stood there with another prisoner whom we had seen many times by the name of Barabbas. And this man, whom up until that moment I knew not his name. And Pilate said, "Citizens of Jerusalem, as it is my custom on this feast of your Passover, I release to you a prisoner. Shall I release to you Barabbas, a murderer and a thief, or shall I release to you Jesus of Nazareth, in whom I find no guilt?" As I stood behind the curtain, I was amazed when the crowd cried out, "Give us Barabbas." It was ridiculous. This man deserved to be crucified 10 times over. And then Pilate says, "But what shall I do with this man in whom I find no guilt?" And it started out quietly. "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" the crowd yelled. Well, that would be my job. So they brought him back down to the courtyard, and I placed on his shoulder his cross. We began the long trip out to Calvary. You see, the Jews wouldn't let us crucify anybody inside their city. We had to go to a place that was called the Place of the Skull. And as we walked, when I would see him stumble, I would kick him in the back. His knees would hit the cobblestone, and he would leave more blood. He would fall forward. His face would smash into the stones. Everywhere he went, he left blood. We got to Calvary. I threw him down on the ground, and I took his arm. I bent over, and I put my knee in his forearm, and I looked at him. Because you see, This was the man who had killed my father and mother. I took the nail and I placed it, and I looked at him. And it was strange because, you see, most men at this time have their eyes closed. And he was looking right at me. It was as if he was looking to the bottom of my soul. And I hit the nail. And I hit the nail. And I hit the nail. And I looked at him, and he had closed his eyes and he had gritted his teeth. But he opened them ever so slightly. And he looked at me. And he said not a word. And it made me angry. As I stepped over him, I kicked him in the ribs. I put my knee on his other arm, and I hit the nail, and I hit the nail, and I hit the nail. Again, his face was closed and contorted. A tear ran from his eyes, and he looked at me, and then he looked into heaven. And he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When he said that, I thought it was nothing. But in my life, it would become everything. After he was raised on the center post and I nailed his feet to the upright, a group of priests and Pharisees cried out, "If you say you're the Son of God, get yourself down from there." And there were other cursings and mockings. Another prisoner mocked him. One of them praised him. It became dark about the 6th hour, like night. Fear struck my heart. About the 9th hour, he cries out, "It is finished. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And he died. That wasn't supposed to happen. It took 2 or 3 days for a man to die on the cross, and this man dies in a few hours. One of the soldiers took a spear and stuck him in the side to see if he would flinch, to see if he was really dead, and he was quite dead. And then Gaius, my centurion, points at him and he says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Now, you Roman citizens know that Caesar's official name is Diu, Son of God. And what Gaius did was he committed treason because he denied that Caesar was the Son of God. And he said this dead man was the Son of God. I could have taken my sword and killed him. But I had received orders to return to Caesarea Philippi to prepare for Pilate's return. And I left this dead man who Gaius said was the Son of God. A sign said he was the King of the Jews, hanging on that cross. Later, I became a centurion. Had many campaigns to Damascus, Syria. And then one day, in the court of the governor Festus, there was a man brought to trial. His name was Paul. He was from Jerusalem. And he was questioned and he spoke, and he was to be flogged or something. And Paul said, "I am a Roman citizen and I appeal my case to Rome, to Caesar." Festus shrugged and he turned to me and he said, "Julius, take this man and some other prisoners and get a ship and take them to Rome. But Julius, remember this, if you lose this man, if you lose any prisoner, as it is our custom, you will die." Well, because this man had been on trial before Festus and King Herod Agrippa, I decided not to take a chance. So when we got on the ship, I chained him to the mast. We sailed about the 9th hour, and we headed west into the sea. Then we turned north as the sun was setting. And as I stood there on the deck, this man asked me, he said, "Do you know Jesus of Nazareth?" My blood turned cold. My knees began to shake. My hands began to quiver. And I said, "You fool, why would you ask me that question?" And he said, "Centurion, Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God, born of a virgin, who was crucified by the Jews, who died, who rose from the dead. And he met me on the road as I was headed to Damascus to persecute his followers. And he said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" I began to cry. And I said, "Sir, you might have persecuted his followers, but it was my hand. It was my hand that held the hammer, that nailed him to the tree. For you see, before I was a centurion, I was a soldier. And after I nailed him, he said, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.' And sir, in all of my career as a soldier, of all the men, women, and children I have killed, I have never felt guilty about anything except that one man. He has stolen so many years from my life, for when I lay my head on my pillow, all I hear is the echo of the hammer." And he said, "Centurion, undo my chains." And so I bent down and I undid him. I was on my knees, and he put his arms around me, and he knelt down. And he said, "Centurion, it was evil men with evil desires who sought the death of this innocent man. And it was an evil thing that you did, Julius. But you were there when he said it is finished." And Julius, he was not talking about his life. He was talking about the payment for the sins of the whole world, Julius, and that included yours. And I said, "Yes. But if what you say of him is true, if he was the Son of God, how could he ever forgive me?" And Paul said, "In the name of Jesus, the living Christ, I forgive you all of your sins, Julius." We talked well into the night. He told me about baptism. And several days later, he did baptize me. But the thing is, I went to the front of the boat and I laid down on a pile of rope. And I closed my eyes. And for the first time in years, I did not hear the echo of the hammer that had haunted me. Well, we finally arrived in Rome after a shipwreck and a long winter in port. And when we arrived there, I told the Tribune, I said, "This man was sent here by Festus and King Agrippa, and he's very dangerous. And I believe, sir, that he needs to be guarded by the best centurion you have, and that is me." And so I stayed with Paul. I cared for Paul. I listened as he sat and he dictated letters to a scribe. And one day, as he was writing a letter to the Christians in the city of Colossae, he said, "God made you alive in Christ. The written code, with its regulations, which condemned you, was canceled and nailed to the cross." And he looked up at me and he smiled and he said, "Julius, that is for you." He said, "You know, as I've told the Romans, all things work together for good, for those who love God. And out of your sin, Julius, out of your sin and the sin of those people and the work of Satan came the redemption of the whole world." Oh, the time that I was able to spend with him. How much I loved him. For you see, this man saved my life. Not just this life, but the forever life. And I would at times I would tell him, I would say, "Paul, I am being attacked. I said, I know you said it is not against flesh and blood that we battle, but the powers and principalities of darkness, and I am being accused again for what I did." And Paul said, "Remember what our brother John said, even when your heart condemns you, Julius, God is greater than your heart." Well, eventually Paul was to be executed. I went to his cell to get him, and I could not show any emotion. because they might think I was one of them. And I went to his cell and I said, Paul, it is time. And he said, yes, Julius, I know. He said, Julius, after I am gone, I want you to tell your story. I want you to give a nail to everyone you meet and tell them that the written code which condemned them with its regulations was canceled and taken away and nailed to the cross, Julius. And you tell them your hand held the hammer. They'll listen to you, Julius. I walked him through the dungeon to the executioner's block. And Paul knelt down and laid his head on the block, and he looked at me and he said, Julius, I love you. I said, I love you too, Paul. He said, I will see you. And the axe fell. I left the prison and packed my gear, and now I'm here to tell you that this Jesus whom I crucified, this Jesus whom I saw die, this Jesus who rose from the dead, this Jesus who ascended into heaven, who fills the universe, did all of this for you. One night on the ship, I remember Paul, he pointed to a star and he said, Julius, do you know what that star is? I said, yes, Paul, that's Polaris. Every Roman soldier knows that. If we get lost, that's how we find our way. He says, you know what Polaris is like, Julius? It's like Christ. Because you see, everything in the night sky goes around that star. And that star does not move. And that's how Christ is. He is the center of everything, Julius. Remember that always. He is the center.
Oh Lord, you're my direction. Oh Lord, you are my source of faith, hope, and love. Oh Lord, you are my north. You're the zero on my compass. You're my rudder in the wind. Oh Lord, you're my beginning. Oh Lord, you are my end. In the storms of life, when I can't see the shore, and it seems that there's no reason to go on anymore, oh Lord, I turn to you as the pilot of my faith. Your hand is steady on the wheel, you'll bring me to your gate. When the waves of trouble crash across the bow of life, and when the thunder rolls from the lightning of my strife, you are the silver lining in a world of guilt and shame. Oh Lord, you're my Redeemer, you call me by my name. And when my journey ends on that great celestial shore, I'll see your smiling face and my tears will be no more. And to the Lamb of God forever we will sing a song
My friends, as you leave, I will give you a nail, and I want you to put it somewhere where you see it every day to remind you that the written code with its regulations that condemned you was canceled and taken away because it was nailed to the cross. And my hand held the hammer. Peace.